This place isn't for people like you." The words landed sharp and loud against the polished marble of the Grand Regent Hotel lobby, slicing through the soft hum of conversations and the faint clink of glasses from the bar. Daniel Brooks didn't bother lowering his voice. In fact, he leaned forward slightly, as if making sure the elegantly dressed guests nearby could hear every syllable. In front of him stood an elderly black woman, her coat worn at the edges, her shoes scuffed from miles of walking, her presence quiet but unshaken. She didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him, her eyes steady, unreadable, almost patient. The chandelier light shimmered above her, catching the subtle glint of a watch on her wrist, simple, understated, but somehow out of place with the rest of her appearance. Daniel followed her silence with a thin smile, one that curled at the edges with quiet judgment. "We have standards here," he added, tapping the counter with a manicured finger. "Guests usually make reservations weeks in advance." A couple standing nearby exchanged glances. Someone shifted uncomfortably, but no one stepped in. The woman finally moved, not back, not away, but forward. She placed her hand gently on the cool marble counter, her fingers steady, her posture composed. "How long have you worked here?" she asked, her voice soft, almost curious, yet carrying an unexpected weight that made Daniel blink. He let out a short laugh, dismissive, waving a hand as if brushing away something insignificant. "Long enough to know who belongs," he said. A faint murmur rippled through the lobby. A phone lifted discreetly from across the room. The woman's expression didn't change. Not a flicker of embarrassment, not a trace of anger. If anything, her calm seemed to deepen, like still water before a storm. "I see," she replied, her voice even. The air shifted. Subtle but real. Daniel felt it for a split second but ignored it, straightening his tie, his confidence returning. "Security will be here in a moment," he added, already turning slightly as if the conversation had ended. But it hadn't. Not for her. Not yet. Somewhere behind them, the elevator chimed softly. No one paid attention at first. Not until footsteps, quick, urgent, cut across the marble floor. The hotel manager appeared, slightly out of breath, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto the woman. And then something changed. Completely. He didn't look at Daniel. He didn't acknowledge the tension or the gathered crowd. He walked straight past the front desk, straight past the confusion, and stopped in front of her. His posture shifted instantly, shoulders lowering, voice careful. Respectful. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "we've been expecting you." And just like that, the silence in the room turned heavy, pressing in on every ear, every glance, every heartbeat. Daniel's smile faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. Daniel Brooks felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, invisible pull as the manager stood in front of the elderly woman, his tone unmistakably respectful. For a moment, Daniel did not move. His hand, still resting on the polished counter, stiffened as if the marble beneath it had turned to ice. "Sir," Daniel began, forcing a light chuckle that did not quite land. "There must be some misunderstanding. This woman does not have a reservation." The manager did not look at him, not even a glance. His attention remained fixed on her, steady and deliberate, as though the rest of the room had faded into the background. "That will not be necessary," he replied calmly, his voice low but firm. Around them, the lobby shifted. Conversations softened into whispers. A woman near the entrance lowered her phone slightly, but did not stop recording. A man in a tailored suit adjusted his stance, suddenly unsure of where to look. The elderly woman finally lifted her gaze toward the manager, her expression unchanged, her presence grounded in a quiet authority that seemed to grow with every passing second. "I hope I did not arrive too early," she said gently. The manager's posture straightened even further. "Not at all, ma'am," he answered. "Everything has been prepared." The words settled into the room like a weight. Daniel's smile thinned, then cracked entirely. He blinked once, then again, trying to realign what he was hearing with what he believed to be true. "Prepared?" he echoed under his breath, the word tasting unfamiliar. His eyes flicked to the woman's coat, her shoes, the simple fabric of her bag, searching for something that would restore the order he had already decided. But there was nothing. Nothing except that watch, catching the chandelier light again, quiet but precise. "Sir," Daniel tried again, his voice sharper now. "With respect, I was handling the situation. She cannot just." Walk in, and Daniel." The manager spoke his name without raising his voice, but it carried enough weight to stop him mid-sentence. For the first time, the manager turned his head slightly, just enough for Daniel to see the look in his eyes. It was not anger. It was something worse. Disappointment. Controlled. Final. Daniel swallowed, the sound dry in his throat. The elderly woman shifted her hand from the counter, folding it gently over the other, as if she had all the time in the world. "You asked how long he has worked here," the manager said, his tone returning to calm, directed now toward her. 3 years. She nodded once, absorbing the information without judgment, without reaction. 3 years, she repeated softly. Then she looked back at Daniel, and for the first time, there was something new in her gaze. Not anger, not pride, just clarity. "That is enough time to learn many things," she said. The words were simple, but they landed with a quiet precision that made Daniel's chest tighten. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Because somewhere, deep beneath the surface, something had already begun to shift, and he could feel it slipping beyond his control. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if one wrong word could shatter it completely. Daniel Brooks felt every eye in the lobby pressing against him now, not with admiration, not with agreement, but with something far less forgiving. Doubt. His fingers curled slightly against the edge of the counter, the polished surface no longer steady beneath his touch. "I was only following protocol," he said finally, his voice lower, tighter, searching for ground that no longer seemed solid. The manager turned fully toward him this time, his expression composed but unyielding. "Protocol," he repeated, as if weighing the word. "Explain which part of our standards instructs you to dismiss a guest based on appearance." The question hung in the air, deliberate and sharp. Daniel opened his mouth, then hesitated. His thoughts moved quickly, but none of them formed into something he could say out loud. Around them, the soft glow of the chandeliers seemed colder now, the reflections on the marble floor sharper, more exposed. A guest near the front desk shifted, crossing his arms. Another shook her head slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough. The elderly woman remained still, her posture relaxed, her presence unwavering. She was not watching the crowd. She was watching Daniel. Not to judge him, not to humiliate him, but as if she were waiting to see what he would choose next. "Sir," Daniel said again, his tone losing its earlier edge, "we have to maintain a certain image. This is a 5-star property. People expect respect," the manager interrupted quietly. "People expect respect." The correction was gentle, but it landed with unmistakable clarity. Daniel's chest tightened. He glanced briefly at the woman, then away, as if the weight of her gaze had become something he could not hold for long. She had not raised her voice once. She had not defended herself, had not demanded anything, had not even stepped back. And somehow, that made everything harder. "What is your name?" she asked him then, her voice steady, cutting through the tension with surprising softness. Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Daniel," he answered automatically. She nodded, as if committing it to memory. "Daniel," she repeated, her tone thoughtful. "When you first saw me, you made a decision in less than a second." He swallowed, saying nothing. "You did not ask who I was," she continued. "You did not ask why I came. You decided, and then you acted." Each word was calm, measured, impossible to dismiss. The lobby felt smaller now, the space between them charged with something heavier than before. The manager remained silent, allowing her words to settle, to do what they needed to do. Daniel shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how quickly confidence could dissolve when it was built on assumptions. He started, then stopped, the rest of the sentence fading before it could take shape. Because somewhere beneath the embarrassment, beneath the tension, a realization had begun to surface, quiet but undeniable, and for the first time since she had walked through those doors, Daniel was no longer certain of anything at all. Daniel felt the weight of her words settle deeper than anything the manager had said, deeper than the silence pressing in from every corner of the lobby. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it lingered, steady and undeniable. He glanced around again, this time not searching for approval, but realizing it was gone. Completely. The guests who had once been background noise were now witnesses, their quiet attention sharper than any confrontation. The elderly woman shifted slightly, her posture still relaxed, But there was purpose now in the way she stood, as if she had stepped fully into a space that had always belonged to her. "I have visited many places like this," she said, her voice calm, carrying just enough to reach the edges of the room. "Some more beautiful, some less. But the difference has never been the marble or the chandeliers." Her eyes moved briefly across the lobby, taking in the polished surfaces, the carefully arranged decor, the illusion of perfection. Then they returned to Daniel. "It has always been the people." The words settled with quiet precision. Daniel's throat tightened. He could feel something shifting inside him, something uncomfortable, something he could not immediately push away. He straightened slightly, trying to regain control of the moment, but the usual confidence did not return. It hovered just out of reach. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now cautious, measured. "If there has been any misunderstanding, I can correct it. We can arrange a room for you immediately." It sounded better in his head than it did in the air. The woman did not move toward the offer. She did not respond with relief or acceptance. Instead, she studied him for a brief moment, as if weighing not his words, but his intention. "A room is not the problem," she said softly. The manager remained still beside her, allowing her to lead, his earlier urgency replaced with quiet attentiveness. Daniel's hands tightened slightly at his sides. "Then what is it you need?" he asked. And this time there was no edge, no arrogance, only uncertainty. The woman paused, just long enough for the silence to return, heavier than before. "I needed to see," she said. Daniel frowned slightly, not understanding. "See what?" he asked. She held his gaze, unwavering. "Whether this place still remembers what it was built on." The question did not sound like a question. It sounded like something else entirely. A test. The realization landed slowly, but when it did, it struck deeper than anything before. Daniel felt it in the stillness of his own thoughts, in the way the room no longer felt like his domain, but something far larger, far more significant than his role behind the desk. The manager exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if a moment long anticipated had finally arrived. "And now?" he asked her, his tone respectful, careful. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze once more across the lobby, taking in the people, the space, the atmosphere that had shifted in ways no one could ignore. Then she looked back at Daniel, her expression unchanged, but her eyes carrying a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "Now," she said, "I know exactly what needs to change." And in that moment, Daniel understood that whatever happened next was no longer about a reservation, or a room, or a simple mistake. It was something far bigger, and it had already begun. Daniel did not realize he had stopped breathing until the silence forced air back into his lungs. The words lingered in his ears, not loud, not sharp, but final. Something needs to change. Not something might. Not something could. Something needs to. The certainty in her voice did not leave room for interpretation. He shifted slightly behind the desk, the familiar space no longer offering comfort. It felt smaller now, like a place he had outgrown without knowing it. "Ma'am," he said carefully, choosing each word as if stepping across uncertain ground. "If there is anything I can do to correct this situation, I am willing to make it right." It was the first time he had spoken without defense, without pride, without the need to prove anything. The woman studied him again, her gaze steady, thoughtful, as if measuring not his words, but the space between them. "Making it right," she repeated softly. "That is an interesting phrase." The manager remained beside her, silent but attentive, his presence no longer urgent but grounded, as if he already understood where this moment was leading. The guests in the lobby had not moved much, but their attention had sharpened. No one was pretending not to listen anymore. Even the soft music in the background seemed distant, like it belonged to a different room. "Tell me, Daniel," she continued, her voice calm, almost gentle, "what would you change if you could start this moment over again?" The question caught him off guard. He blinked, his mind racing back through the last few minutes, replaying every word, every glance, every assumption he had made without thinking. He opened his mouth, then hesitated, the answer forming slowly, honestly this time. "I would have asked your name," he said. The words felt simple, but they carried weight. "And I would have listened." The woman nodded once, a small movement, but one that seemed to acknowledge something real. "Yes," she said quietly. That would have been a beginning. Daniel felt something settle inside him, Not relief. Not yet, but understanding. It was uncomfortable, but it was clear. The kind of clarity that could not be ignored once it arrived. But beginnings matter, she added, her tone shifting slightly, deeper now. Because they shape everything that follows. The manager finally spoke again, his voice measured. The Grand Regent was built on a very simple principle, he said. That every person who walks through those doors is treated with dignity, regardless of who they are or how they appear. Daniel lowered his gaze for a moment. The truth of that statement landing harder now than it ever had during training sessions or employee briefings. It was no longer a policy. It was something he had failed to carry. The woman stepped slightly away from the counter, her movements unhurried, deliberate. I did not come here for a room, she said. And I did not come here for an apology. Daniel looked up again, confusion flickering across his face. Then why did you come? He asked quietly. She paused, just long enough for the room to lean in once more, for the question to take shape in every mind present. Then she met his eyes, her expression calm, but undeniable. I came, she said, to see if this place still deserved what it has just been given. The words settled heavily, and somewhere in the distance, the meaning began to unfold, not all at once, but enough to make Daniel's chest tighten again, because whatever she meant, it was far bigger than he had imagined, and it was already too late to pretend otherwise. The words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the walls, the marble, the quiet tension that no one dared to interrupt. Daniel felt them fully now, not just hearing them, but understanding the weight behind them. Something had just been given. Not requested. Not negotiated. Given. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he had missed, what had been unfolding right in front of him without his awareness. Given. He repeated under his breath, the word unfamiliar in this context. The manager shifted slightly beside the woman. His expression no longer just respectful, but certain, as if the moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. The transfer was completed this morning, he said calmly, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. A ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable. Someone inhaled sharply. Another guest leaned closer, eyes widening just enough to betray curiosity turning into realization. Daniel's gaze snapped toward the manager. Transfer, he asked, his voice barely steady. The woman did not rush to explain. She simply watched him, allowing the truth to surface piece by piece, the way understanding often does when it cannot be forced. The manager nodded once, confirming what had not yet been fully spoken. Ownership, he clarified. The word landed heavier than anything before it. Daniel felt it in his chest, in the sudden stillness of his thoughts, in the way every assumption he had made began to collapse at once. Ownership. His eyes moved back to the woman, this time not searching for flaws, not measuring her against anything external, but seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time since she had walked through the doors. The worn coat, the scuffed shoes, the quiet watch, none of it had changed, but everything about it felt different now. Or maybe it always had been. He just had not noticed. You? He started, but the sentence would not complete. The woman offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of triumph, not of satisfaction, but of understanding. I prefer to observe before I introduce myself, she said gently. It tells me more. Daniel swallowed, the weight of those words settling deeper than the revelation itself. Because this had not been an accident. This had been a moment, a test, and he had already taken it. The manager stepped back half a pace, creating space, allowing the moment to belong to her. Welcome to the Grand Regent, he said formally, though the irony did not go unnoticed by anyone in the room. The woman's gaze moved briefly across the lobby once more, taking in the guests, the staff, the atmosphere that had shifted so completely in just a few minutes. It is a beautiful place, she said quietly. Then she looked back at Daniel. But beauty is easy to create. He felt the words before he fully understood them. What is difficult, she continued, is consistency. Treating every person the same when no one is watching. The sentence settled with quiet force. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment, not in shame alone, but in recognition. He had not been unseen. Not really. And now, there was no way to return to what he had been just minutes before. The woman stepped slightly closer, not invading, not confronting, but closing the distance just enough to make the moment real. Tell me, Daniel, she said softly. If I had introduced myself first, would anything you said have been different? The question did not accuse. It revealed. And Daniel, standing there beneath the glow of the chandeliers, realized that the answer mattered more than anything that had already happened. The question did not need to be repeated. It lingered between them, quiet but undeniable, pressing against Daniel's thoughts until there was no space left to avoid it. If I had introduced myself first, would anything you said have been different? He felt the answer before he could form it, before he could soften it, before he could reshape it into something safer. Yes, the word echoed in his mind, clear and immediate, and that clarity unsettled him more than anything else that had happened. His gaze dropped for a brief moment, then returned to hers, no longer guarded, no longer certain. Yes, he said, his voice low, honest in a way it had not been before. The admission settled into the room with a weight that shifted everything again, not dramatically, but deeply. The woman studied him, not with disappointment, not with judgment, but with something far more measured. Understanding. That is what I needed to know, she said quietly. Around them, the tension changed. It did not disappear, but it transformed, moving from confrontation into something more reflective, more revealing. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath unsteady, as if he had been holding on to something he could no longer justify. I made a decision without knowing anything about you, he continued, the words coming more easily now, not rehearsed, not defensive, just real. And I treated you based on that decision. The woman nodded slightly. You treated me based on what you believed I represented, she corrected gently. Daniel felt the distinction immediately. It was not just about her. It was about him, about what he saw, about what he assumed. The manager remained silent, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption, his earlier authority now replaced with quiet observation. This was no longer about enforcing rules. It was about understanding them. I have spent many years walking into places where people decide who I am before I speak, the woman said, her voice calm, steady, carrying the weight of experience without bitterness. Sometimes they are right. Often they are not. The room listened, not out of obligation, but because something in her tone demanded it. Not loudly, but completely. Daniel swallowed, his throat tight again, but for a different reason this time. Not pressure. Recognition. What matters, she continued, is not whether you guess correctly. It is whether you give someone the chance to tell you. The simplicity of the statement made it land harder. Daniel nodded slowly, the movement small but sincere. I did not give you that chance, he said. No, she replied. You did not. There was no anger in the words. Just truth. And somehow, that made them more difficult to carry. A quiet pause followed, not uncomfortable, but necessary, as if the moment needed space to settle fully before anything else could move forward. Daniel straightened slightly, not to reclaim authority, but to stand with intention, aware now of the weight of even the smallest actions. I cannot change what I did, he said carefully, but I can choose what I do next. The woman held his gaze for a moment longer, as if measuring not the words, but the resolve behind them. Then, slowly, she nodded. That, she said, is where change begins. And in that moment, beneath the steady glow of the chandeliers and the watchful silence of the room, something shifted again, not in appearance, not in status, but in understanding, and Daniel knew with quiet certainty that whatever happened next would define far more than just this moment. The moment did not rush forward. It unfolded slowly, like something deliberate, something that could not be forced. Daniel stood straighter now, not out of habit, not out of performance, but because something inside him had shifted into place. The space behind the front desk no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a responsibility. He glanced briefly at the manager, then back at the woman, grounding himself in the reality of where he stood and what this moment had become. Then I would like to begin again, he said. His voice steady, not loud, but clear enough to carry. The words did not seek approval. They marked a decision. The woman watched him, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle softness now, something that had not been there before. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But openness. Go ahead, she replied quietly. Daniel took a small breath, not to steady nerves, but to focus. Good afternoon, ma'am, he said, this time without assumption, without judgment, without the weight of what he thought he knew. Welcome to the Grand Regent. My name is Daniel Brooks. How may I assist you today? The simplicity of the greeting carried more weight than anything he had said before. It was not polished. It was not rehearsed. It was intentional. The lobby remained silent, but the tension had changed again. It no longer pressed down. It listened. The woman held his gaze for a moment, as if measuring the difference between now and before. Then, slowly, she nodded. That is better, she said. The words were not praise. They were acknowledgement. And somehow, that meant more. The manager allowed himself the faintest shift in posture, a quiet release of tension that had been building beneath his calm exterior. Around them, the guests began to relax, though no one fully disengaged. The moment still held them, not because of conflict, but because of what it revealed. The woman adjusted the strap of her bag slightly, a small, ordinary movement that grounded the scene back into something real. Now, she continued, we can speak properly. Daniel inclined his head slightly, attentive, present in a way he had not been before. I would like to review the guest experience across all departments, she said, her tone shifting just enough to signal purpose. Front desk, housekeeping, dining, concierge. Everything. Daniel blinked once, the scope of her request settling in. This was no longer a single interaction. It was the entire system, the entire culture. Of course, he replied, without hesitation this time. I can coordinate with the department leads immediately. The manager stepped in slightly, his voice calm but efficient. We have already prepared preliminary reports, he said, but I believe she would prefer to see it firsthand. The woman gave a small nod, confirming it without needing to repeat it. I prefer to observe, she said. Daniel felt a flicker of recognition at the phrase. Of course she did. That was how all of this had begun. He straightened once more, not out of formality, but readiness. Then I will assist you, he said. The woman paused, just for a moment, her eyes steady on his. You will, she agreed. And in that simple exchange, something shifted again, not just in Daniel, not just in the room, but in the direction of everything that would follow, because this was no longer about a mistake, or even a lesson, but about what would happen next, and whether change would remain a moment or become something lasting. The shift from stillness to movement was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but it carried a different kind of weight. Daniel stepped out from behind the front desk, leaving the place where he had stood for years, the place that had once defined his role, his authority, his certainty. Now it felt like a starting point he had just learned to see clearly for the first time. This way, he said, his voice steady, guiding rather than directing. The woman walked beside him, unhurried, her steps measured, her presence unchanged despite everything that had just unfolded. The manager followed slightly behind, allowing space, observing quietly as the dynamic shifted into something new. As they moved through the lobby, the guests parted naturally, not out of instruction, but out of awareness. Conversations resumed in low murmurs, but attention lingered, following them as they crossed the polished floor toward the inner corridors of the hotel. The soft lighting transitioned as they moved deeper inside, from the bright openness of the lobby into the warmer tones of the guest hallways. Most of our guests arrived through the front desk, Daniel began, his tone thoughtful now, less rehearsed, more reflective. It sets the tone for everything else. The woman glanced at him briefly. Yes, she said. It does. The agreement was simple, but it carried meaning, reminding him of the moment he had just lived through. They passed a housekeeping cart stationed neatly along the wall. A staff member paused, offering a polite nod. Daniel returned it, but this time with a different awareness, noticing details he might have overlooked before. The woman's gaze lingered there for a second longer, observing not just the action, but the interaction. How often do you review staff training? She asked. Daniel considered the question carefully. Quarterly, he replied. Then after a brief pause, he added, formally. The distinction hung there, quiet but significant. The woman nodded slightly, as if that single word had confirmed something for her. And informally, she asked. Daniel hesitated, then answered honestly. Not as often as we should. The corridor opened into a lounge area, where a few guests sat with coffee, the low hum of conversation blending with soft background music. A server moved between tables, attentive but unobtrusive. The woman slowed her pace just slightly, watching the interactions, the timing, the small gestures that defined service more than any manual ever could. Details, she said softly, almost to herself. They reveal everything. Daniel followed her gaze, seeing what she saw, not just the service, but the consistency or the lack of it. The manager stepped forward slightly, adding context. We have strong metrics, he said. Customer satisfaction scores, response times, retention. The woman turned her head just enough to acknowledge him. Metrics measure outcomes, she said. I am interested in behavior. The distinction landed clearly. Daniel felt it again, that quiet shift in understanding, the realization that numbers alone could not capture what had just happened in the lobby. They could not measure assumptions. They could not record moments of judgment. They could not quantify dignity. We will continue, she said, her tone steady, purposeful. Daniel nodded. Yes, ma'am. And as they moved forward together, deeper into the hotel, the distance from the front desk grew, but the weight of what had begun there did not fade. It followed them, shaping every step, every observation, every word, because this was no longer a tour. It was a reckoning, and Daniel knew that by the time they returned to where they had started, nothing would feel the same again. The hallway opened into the dining area, where warm lighting reflected softly off polished wood and glass, creating an atmosphere designed to feel effortless, almost invisible in its perfection. A server paused near the entrance, offering a welcoming nod, her posture attentive, her smile natural but measured. Daniel noticed it immediately this time, not as background, but as part of a system that either held together or quietly failed in moments no one tracked. The woman stepped forward, her pace unhurried, her eyes moving across the room with quiet precision. She was not looking for flaws. She was observing patterns. Good evening, the server said politely, her tone even and respectful, offering the same greeting she would give anyone who entered. The woman inclined her head slightly in return. Good evening, she replied, her voice just as calm, just as present. Daniel felt the difference again, subtle but important. No hesitation, no assumption, just interaction. They moved further inside, passing a table where a couple sat in quiet conversation. The server approached them with water, placing the glasses gently, her movements smooth, practiced. The woman paused, watching the timing, the eye contact, the small pause before the server stepped away. Consistency, she said softly. Daniel nodded, following her gaze. We train for it, he replied. She looked at him briefly. Training creates awareness, she said. Habits create consistency. The distinction settled in immediately. Daniel felt it again. That shift, the difference between what was taught and what was lived. The manager stepped closer, adding context. We monitor performance closely, he said. Service reviews are conducted weekly. The woman gave a small nod, acknowledging the effort without dismissing it. And yet, she said, her tone still even, moments like the one in the lobby still happen. The sentence was not an accusation. It was a fact, and facts were harder to argue with than opinions. Daniel felt it land, not as pressure this time, but as responsibility. He looked around the room again, seeing it differently now, not as a finished product, but as something constantly in motion, shaped by every decision, every interaction, every assumption. They do, he said quietly. The admission came easier now. The woman turned slightly, facing him more directly. Then the question is not whether your systems are effective, she said. It is whether your culture is aligned with them. The words settled deeply. Daniel considered them, not quickly, not defensively, but carefully. Because for the first time, he understood that what had happened earlier was not an isolated mistake. It was a reflection, a signal. The manager remained silent again, allowing the weight of the conversation to settle without interference. The room continued around them, unaware that something fundamental was being examined in its midst. The woman stepped toward an empty table, running her fingers lightly across the edge, not inspecting, not searching for dust or imperfection, but grounding herself in the space. People remember how they are treated, she said, long after they forget everything else. Daniel watched her, the simplicity of the statement carrying more truth than any report he had ever reviewed. He nodded slowly. Yes, he said. She looked up at him again, her gaze steady, clear. Then that is where you begin, she said. Not with policies, not with numbers, with people. The sentence did not echo, but it remained, settling into the space between them as they stood there, in a room designed to impress, yet now defined by something far less visible, something far more important. And as Daniel stood there, absorbing every word, he realized that what they were building in this moment would not be written in manuals or measured in reports, but lived, one interaction at a time, starting with the very next one. The dining room continued its quiet rhythm around them, untouched by the shift unfolding beneath its surface, yet somehow shaped by it all the same. Daniel stood still for a moment longer, letting the words settle fully, not rushing to respond, not reaching for something polished or rehearsed. For the first time, he allowed silence to do its work. The woman stepped away from the table, her fingers leaving the smooth edge as if marking the end of one thought and the beginning of another. "Let us return," she said calmly. Daniel nodded at once. "Yes, ma'am." The path back felt different. The same hallway, the same lighting, the same quiet details, yet everything carried a new weight, as if each step now held meaning he had never considered before. A housekeeper passed them again, offering a polite smile. This time, Daniel paused just slightly. "Thank you," he said to her, not out of obligation, but with intention. She looked surprised for a brief moment, then smiled more fully before continuing on her way. The woman noticed. She did not comment, but her eyes lingered just long enough to acknowledge it. Small things, Daniel realized. Always the small things. They entered the lobby once more, the open space greeting them with its familiar brightness, yet it no longer felt the same. The front desk stood exactly where he had left it, but it no longer felt like a place to stand behind. It felt like a place to stand accountable. The guests who had remained earlier were still there, though their attention had softened, their curiosity settling into quiet observation. The moment had passed for them, but for Daniel, it was only beginning. The manager stepped forward slightly, his posture composed, his voice measured. "Would you like to proceed with the executive briefing?" he asked. The woman considered the question for a brief moment, her gaze moving once more across the lobby, as if measuring something invisible to everyone else. Then she shook her head gently. "Not yet," she said. Daniel felt a flicker of uncertainty, but it did not grow into anxiety. Not this time. He waited. The woman turned to him again, her expression calm, but purposeful. "There is one more thing I would like to see," she said. Daniel inclined his head slightly. "Of course. What would that be?" She held his gaze, steady and clear. "I would like to see how you handle the next guest who walks through that door." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything that had come before. Not a report, not a system, not a discussion. A moment. Real, immediate, unfiltered. Daniel felt it instantly, the shift from reflection to action, from understanding to demonstration. He turned slightly toward the entrance, his attention drawn to the glass doors as if they had suddenly become the center of everything. The lobby quieted again, not entirely, but enough. Enough for anticipation to take hold. The manager remained silent, observing, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. The woman stepped back just slightly, giving space, but not distance. Her presence remained, steady and watchful. And then, as if on cue, the doors opened. A figure stepped inside, pausing just long enough to take in the room, uncertain, hesitant. Daniel felt his breath steady, his thoughts clear in a way they had never been before. This was it. Not a test announced, not a lesson explained. A moment. And this time, he understood exactly what it meant. The glass doors closed softly behind the figure, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to narrow toward that single point of entry. Daniel stepped forward before hesitation could take hold, his posture steady, his pace calm, not rushed, not forced. The person who had entered was a young man, maybe in his early 20s, dressed simply, a worn backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes scanning the lobby with a mix of uncertainty and quiet hope. Daniel noticed it immediately. Not the clothes, not the bag, the feeling. He stopped, at a respectful distance, offering a small, genuine smile. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice even, grounded. "Welcome to the Grand Regent. My name is Daniel. How may I assist you today?" The words were familiar, but the intention behind them was entirely new. The young man hesitated for a second, as if unsure whether the welcome was real or routine. Then he nodded slightly. "Hi, I was wondering if you had any rooms available," he said, his voice careful, almost apologetic. Daniel held his gaze, attentive, not interrupting, not assuming. "We do," he replied. "Are you staying for one night or longer?" The young man blinked. The question simple, but it seemed to catch him off guard. "Just one night," he said. Daniel nodded. "All right," he said. "Let me check what we have available for you." He turned briefly to the system, but his focus did not leave the interaction. He was aware now, fully aware, of every word, every tone, every pause. "We have a standard room available," he continued, turning back. "Would you like me to walk you through the details?" The young man's shoulders relaxed slightly, just enough to notice. "Yeah, that would be great," he said. Daniel explained the room, the amenities, the pricing, not rushing, not overselling, just providing clear, respectful information. When he finished, he paused. "Does that work for you?" he asked. The young man nodded, a small smile appearing for the first time. "Yeah, it does. Thank you." Daniel inclined his head slightly. "You are welcome," he said. "I will just need your name to complete the booking." As the young man provided his information, Daniel processed it efficiently, but without losing the connection of the moment. When it was done, he handed over the key card, his movements calm, deliberate. "Your room is on the 4th floor," he said. "If you need anything at all, please let us know." The young man took the card, his grip firm now, his uncertainty replaced with something lighter. "Thank you," he said again, this time without hesitation. Daniel nodded once more. "Enjoy your stay," he replied. The young man turned and walked toward the elevators, his steps more confident than when he had entered. The doors closed, and the lobby returned to its quiet rhythm. Daniel stood still for a moment, the interaction settling within him, not as a task completed, but as something understood. Behind him, the woman remained silent, but her presence had not shifted. It had deepened, and Daniel knew, without needing to turn around, that this moment had been seen, fully, clearly, and that what came next would matter just as much as everything that had already happened. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, and for a moment, the lobby seemed to exhale, as if something quiet but significant had just passed through it. Daniel remained where he stood, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the desk, not out of habit, but as if grounding himself in the reality of what had just happened. The interaction had been simple. No tension, no correction, no hesitation, just presence, just respect. He turned slowly, meeting the woman's gaze again. She had not moved, not physically, but something in her expression had shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably there. Not approval, not yet, but recognition. "You did not rush him," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head slightly. "He did not need to be rushed," he replied. The answer came easily, without calculation. The woman studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once. "And you did not decide who he was before he spoke," she continued. Daniel exhaled softly, the truth of that statement settling in. "No," he said, "I did not." The manager stepped closer, his posture composed, but there was something lighter in his presence now, as if the tension he had carried earlier had eased. "That is the standard," he said calmly. The woman glanced briefly toward him, then back to Daniel. "No," she corrected gently. "That is the beginning." The distinction lingered, quiet but important. Daniel felt it fully. This was not the end of something. It was the start of something else entirely. The woman took a small step forward, closing the space just slightly, her presence steady, grounded. "A single moment does not define a culture," she said, "but it reveals it." Daniel nodded slowly, the weight of that truth settling deeper than anything before. Because this time, the moment had revealed something different, something better. "And what happens after this," she continued, "is what will matter most." The lobby moved around them again, the rhythm of the hotel returning, but Daniel no longer saw it as background. He saw it as a series of moments, each one carrying the same weight as the one that had just passed. Each one an opportunity, each one a choice. "I understand," he said quietly. The woman held his gaze for one last moment. Then finally, she extended her hand. The gesture was simple, but it carried more meaning than any title or announcement could. Daniel looked at it briefly, then met her eyes again before accepting it, his grip steady, respectful. "Evelyn Carter," she said. Her name settled into the space, not as a revelation meant to shock, but as a truth that no longer needed to be hidden. Daniel nodded once. "Daniel Brooks," he replied, though she already knew. A faint smile touched her expression, small but real. Yes, she said softly. I know. She released his hand, turning slightly toward the manager. We will continue tomorrow, she said. There is more to see. The manager inclined his head. Of course. Evelyn glanced once more across the lobby, her eyes moving over the people, the space, the quiet details that now carried meaning beyond appearance. Then she began to walk toward the elevators, her pace unhurried, her presence unchanged. Daniel watched her go, not with uncertainty, not with fear, but with clarity. The doors opened. She stepped inside, and as they closed again, Daniel understood something he had not known before. This place had not changed because she arrived. It had changed because he finally chose to see it differently. And now, the real work was just beginning.